The history of slavery serves as a painful and stark reminder of humanity's capability for cruelty and oppression. In the United States, slavery was deeply ingrained, spanning from the colonial era through the antebellum period. During this dark period, enslaved Africans and their descendants were subjected to forced labor, physical punishment, and various forms of degradation. The term antebellum is derived from Latin, where ante means before and bellum means war. In the context of American history, the antebellum era refers to the period preceding the American Civil War, specifically the years from the late 18th century, after the War of 1812, to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. This term is commonly used to describe this period because it encapsulates the distinct social, economic, and political characteristics of the time, which ultimately led to the conflict and division resulting in the Civil War. During the antebellum South, slavery played a central role. Plantation owners, especially those from the planter class, relied heavily on slave labor. Slavery went from being portrayed as an embarrassing and temporary system to being defended as a positive good by Southern intellectuals and leaders. The abolitionist movement, which opposed slavery, faced harsh criticism from these leaders. The demand for slave labor, coupled with the U.S. ban on importing more slaves from Africa, drove up slave prices. This made it profitable for smaller farms in established areas, such as Virginia, to sell their slaves further south and west. While most Southern farmers had small to medium-sized farms with few slaves, large plantation owners with substantial numbers of slaves held considerable prestige and political power. During the antebellum era, the United States grappled with various issues, including states' rights, the expansion of slavery into new territories, and tensions between the North and the South. These factors contributed to the eventual outbreak of the Civil War, which had a profound and lasting impact on the nation. However, amid the well-documented dehumanization and mistreatment of slaves, there's a lesser-known aspect: the abuse suffered by black male slaves at the hands of elite white women from the planter class. These women were part of the wealthy plantation-owning class and played significant roles in the economic and social aspects of slavery. White women in the antebellum South, despite societal limitations on their roles, had substantial power concerning the management and treatment of enslaved individuals, including black male slaves. They could issue commands, give instructions, and enforce discipline within their homes and on plantations. While white women couldn't vote or hold office, they could buy, sell, and own enslaved people, effectively treating them as their property. Historical evidence, including interviews with formerly enslaved individuals conducted during the Great Depression, reveals that white girls were trained from a young age in slave ownership, discipline, and mastery. Some received enslaved people as gifts when they were as young as 9 months old. This upbringing instilled in them the belief in their absolute authority over others. One disturbing aspect of the abuse endured by black male slaves was sexual exploitation. Despite the prevailing narrative portraying white women as passive or innocent, there were instances where they actively engaged in non-consensual sexual relationships and rape, exploiting their power and control over black male slaves. These actions perpetuated a cycle of sexual violence and degradation, further dehumanizing those who were already enslaved. Here's an example from the autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by Harriet Jacobs, who was once a slave herself. Jacobs recounts how plantation owners' daughters would exploit male slaves. They knew that female slaves were under their father's authority, and in some cases, they exercised the same authority over male slaves. I have personally witnessed an instance where the head of a household, a master, felt ashamed. It was widely known in the neighborhood that his daughter had chosen one of the most oppressed and brutalized slaves on his plantation to father her first grandchild. Her advances were not directed towards equals or even towards her father's more intelligent servants. Instead, she chose the most brutalized individuals over whom her authority could be exerted with less fear of exposure. The type of relationship described by the author clearly indicates sexually predatory behavior. Such actions, as Jacobs confirms, were not uncommon, and they cannot be classified as consensual in any meaningful sense. They, in fact, constitute a form of sexual abuse, if not rape. These examples demonstrate how plantation mistresses and elite women, like their male counterparts, had the ability to sexually control and abuse their slaves. Another way in which planter-class white women exercised sexual control over slaves was by threatening to accuse them of rape, or attempted rape if they did not comply with their demands. This manipulation relied on the idea that they were weak and needed protection from white men, which, in turn, allowed for control and domination over black male slaves. The reasons why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves likely varied by situation. Some may have been motivated by boredom or sexual frustration. However, on a subconscious level, sexually exploiting slaves may have provided them with a sense of power to compensate for their lack of control in other aspects of their lives. Plantation-class women were considered the property of their husbands and had limited sexual agency compared to men. While this does not excuse the actions of sexually abusive white women, it suggests that female sexual abuse of slave men might have occurred even if women had held higher social status. Similar to how slave-owning white women often vented their frustrations through excessive cruelty and violence towards slaves, they may have used sex as a means of domination and control in a society where they held relatively little power. Their freedom and mobility were severely restricted. For example, they were generally not allowed to travel without an older male chaperone. Spousal abuse was often seen as a legitimate means for men to control their wives during the antebellum era. Private records reveal that many plantation women were unhappy with their lack of freedom and the expectation that they remain obedient and cheerful while their husbands had affairs with or raped female slaves. The knowledge that mixed-race slave children were the offspring of their husbands was both humiliating and heartbreaking. In essence, the abuse and exploitation of black male slaves by white women, whether sexual or physical, represent a dark and painful chapter in history. Recognizing these historical injustices is crucial for a more inclusive and equitable future. Please feel free to share your thoughts on this topic in the comment section, and stay tuned for more in-depth content on the abuse of black male slaves during the antebellum era. Thank you for your continued support, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.